In the harsh winter of 1944, as American Sherman tanks rolled by the thousands across the European theatre, captured Wehrmacht General Friedrich Paulus was heard muttering in disbelief. "We never knew America had this capability. Our intelligence failed us completely." The sight of 50,000 American tanks, more than all German tanks produced during the entire war, broke not just the Nazi military machine, but the illusion of German technological superiority that had sustained the Third Reich's leadership through years of brutal conflict. As the German officers stood speechless on that frigid December morning, watching endless columns of American armor stretch to the horizon, they finally understood the fatal miscalculation that had sealed their nation's fate long before the first shot was fired. They had awakened an industrial giant that could outproduce the entire Axis many times over, and now that giant was at their doorstep. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touched you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The story begins in 1941, not on the battlefield, but in the quiet offices of German military intelligence in Berlin. Colonel Hans Weber, head of the Wehrmacht's Industrial Assessment Division, sat reviewing reports about American manufacturing capabilities. The numbers before him seemed impossible, projections suggesting that the Americans could potentially produce tanks at a rate 10 times greater than Germany's output. "Propaganda," he muttered, striking his pen through the report. "The Americans are skilled at deception. Their automobile factories cannot simply convert to tank production overnight. It would take years, not months." Weber's dismissal of these intelligence reports would prove to be one of the most consequential mistakes of the war. His skepticism reflected a broader German belief that America, despite its wealth, was a sleeping giant that would take too long to mobilize its industrial might. By the time American factories could reach full war production, the Germans believed Europe would already be fully under Nazi control. What Weber and his colleagues failed to understand was the fundamental nature of American industrial capacity and the remarkable speed with which it could be transformed. In Detroit, Michigan, the story was unfolding very differently. Henry Wilson was a foreman at the Ford River Rouge complex, one of the largest industrial facilities in the world. On le 8 décembre 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor, Wilson arrived at work to find engineers swarming across the factory floor. "Gentlemen," announced the plant manager to the assembled workforce, "as of this moment, we are no longer in the business of building automobiles. We are now building machines to win this war." Wilson watched in amazement over the next several weeks as the massive assembly lines that had once produced family sedans were methodically reconfigured. Specifications for the Wehrmacht Sherman tank replaced car blueprints. Heavy machinery was moved in. Workers accustomed to installing windshields and door panels were hastily retrained to mount armor plating and gun turrets. What the Germans had deemed impossible was happening at breathtaking speed, not just at Ford, but at General Motors, Chrysler, and hundreds of other factories across America. By March 1942, the first tanks were already rolling off these converted assembly lines. The achievement stunned even the American military planners who had ordered the conversion. What had taken Germany years of dedicated planning was accomplished in America in a matter of months. Back in Berlin, updated reports of American production began to trickle in. Colonel Weber dismissed the initial figures as exaggerations. 800 tanks in April? Impossible. Their quality must be abysmal. They're probably counting tractors with sheet metal attached. But as the numbers grew, 000 tanks in May, 5 cents in June, 000 in July, a sense of unease began to spread through German high command. Still, Hitler's inner circle remained convinced that American industrial output, while impressive on paper, would matter little in the actual conflict. "Their tanks will sit in North American ports," declared Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel during a staff meeting in the summer of 1942. "The U-boats will ensure they never reach European shores." This second miscalculation proved as disastrous as the first. American shipyards, converting to war production with the same remarkable speed as the auto factories, began churning out Liberty ships at an unprecedented rate. What had once taken months to build was now being completed in weeks, then days. The record, set by the SS Robert E. Peary, was just 4 days and 15 hours from keel laying to launch. These cargo vessels, sailing in protected convoys, began delivering an ever-increasing stream of tanks to England, North Africa, and eventually to the Soviet Union through the perilous Murmansk route. German U-boats, deadly as they were, could simply not sink ships fast enough to stem the rising tide of American production. By late 1942, the first large formations of American armor were appearing on battlefields, initially in North Africa, where they faced Rommel's vaunted Afrika Korps. The German generals, who had been told that American tanks would be of poor quality and operated by inexperienced crews, were shocked by what they encountered. While it was true that the early Sherman tanks had weaknesses, particularly in armor thickness, compared to later German Panthers and Tigers, they possessed 2 crucial advantages: reliability and, above all, overwhelming numbers. For every German tank disabled by mechanical failure, a common occurrence with the sophisticated but maintenance-intensive German designs, the Americans could field 10 more Shermans. For every Sherman knocked out in combat, 3 more would appear the next day. Captured German tank commander Otto Carius would later write in his memoirs, "We could destroy 10 of their tanks for every one of ours, and still, they kept coming." It was like fighting against the tide itself. As the tide of war began to turn against Germany in 1943, Hitler demanded his own miracle of production. Albert Speer, the Reich armaments minister, was ordered to match American output. Speer, brilliant as he was, faced insurmountable obstacles: Allied bombing, resource shortages, and a German industrial base that, despite its efficiency, was a fraction of America's size. In a desperate bid to increase production, the Nazi regime turned to slave labor from conquered territories and concentration camps. The human cost was appalling, but even this moral atrocity failed to close the production gap. For every tank Germany painstakingly produced, America built 4, and did so with well-paid workers putting in voluntary overtime for the war effort. By early 1944, as preparations for the D-Day landings accelerated, vast tank parks spread across the English countryside. British General Bernard Montgomery, surveying one such collection that stretched across several fields, remarked to an American colleague, "I never truly understood what your president meant by the arsenal of democracy until this moment." When the Allies landed in Normandy in June 1944, they brought with them an armoured force of unprecedented size. Despite fierce German resistance and the hedgerow terrain that initially favoured defenders, the sheer volume of American armour made the outcome inevitable. When breakouts like Operation Cobra finally occurred, the Americans were able to pour thousands of tanks into the gaps in German lines. It was during the Falaise Pocket Battle in August 1944 that German General Günther von Kluge first witnessed the full impact of American production. From a hillside observation post, he watched through binoculars as an endless column of Sherman tanks moved along the horizon. For more than 3 hours, the column never ceased. "It's not a tank unit," he reportedly told his staff officer. "It's a tank army. Where are they getting them all?" The answer, had he known it, would have been even more demoralizing. What he was seeing was just a small fraction of America's tank production. For every tank on the battlefield, another was in transit, and 2 more were rolling off assembly lines back in the United States. As the Allied forces pushed into Germany itself in early 1945, the psychological impact of American production became as important as its tactical value. German soldiers, raised on propaganda about German engineering superiority, found their worldview shattered by the endless supply of American equipment. One German private, captured near the Rhine in March 1945, told his American interrogators, "We were told your tanks were made of tin and would fall apart, but they didn't fall apart. They just kept coming, thousands of them, more than we could ever hope to destroy." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. In February 1945, a group of captured German generals, including Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, were being transported to a prisoner of war facility in France. Their route took them past an American supply depot, where newly arrived Sherman tanks were being prepped for deployment to the front lines. For nearly an hour, their vehicle drove past row after row of tanks, each bearing the white star of the U.S. Army. The generals, once the proud commanders of what they had believed to be the world's most formidable military force, sat in stunned silence. Finally, von Rundstedt, who had commanded German forces during the Battle of the Bulge, spoke quietly to his fellow officers. "This," he said, gesturing toward the endless ranks of American armor, "is what defeated Germany. Not strategy, not courage, but this." We never knew America had this capability. Had I seen this in 1939, I would have told Hitler one thing: make peace at any cost. The final statistics tell the story more clearly than any anecdote could. Between 1942 and 1945, American factories produced approximately 50,000 Sherman tanks and their variants. Germany, during the entire war, managed to produce roughly 25,000 tanks of all types combined. But the story of American production goes beyond mere numbers. It represents a fundamental difference in approach to industrial warfare. German tank design emphasized quality over quantity, producing technically superior machines in relatively small numbers. The German Tiger tank, with its formidable 428 mm gun, could destroy a Sherman from distances where the American tank couldn't effectively return fire. But Tigers were complex, expensive, prone to mechanical failure, and most importantly, rare. The American approach, shaped by the nation's experience with mass production, prioritized standardization, simplicity, and volume. The Sherman was designed to be built quickly, shipped easily, maintained in the field with minimal specialized equipment, and produced in overwhelming numbers. This philosophy extended beyond tanks to every aspect of war production, from aircraft to artillery, from rifles to radio sets. While German soldiers might have better individual equipment, American forces had more of everything, with plentiful replacements and abundant ammunition. The truth that German intelligence failed to grasp until it was too late was that modern industrialized warfare had become a contest of production capacity as much as battlefield tactics. America's seemingly limitless ability to replace loss and supply its forces, and those of its allies, meant that every German victory was ultimately Pyrrhic. Each destroyed American tank was quickly replaced by several more, while German losses became increasingly irreplaceable as the war progressed. Perhaps most remarkably, America's massive military production occurred while its civilian economy continued to function. Unlike in Germany, where civilians faced increasing privation as the war continued, American civilians experienced rationing but no true hardship. The American economy was so vast that it could simultaneously supply its own military, support its allies through Lend-Lease, and still maintain the highest civilian standard of living among any of the major combatants. In the final analysis, the story of America's tank production represents more than just an industrial achievement. It embodies a national transformation, from a country still recovering from the Great Depression to the world's dominant industrial and military power in the span of just a few years. When those Wehrmacht generals watched in disbelief as American tanks rolled past them in seemingly endless numbers, they were witnessing not just the instruments of their defeat, but the birth of the American century that would follow. The lesson was not lost on the post-war world. Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, who had benefited from American Lend-Lease equipment throughout the war, ordered his planners to prioritize production capacity in the Cold War that followed. Quantity, he reportedly told his generals while reflecting on the American example, has a quality all its own. For the German officers who survived the war, the revelation of America's true industrial capacity left psychological scars as deep as any battlefield defeat. In post-war interrogations conducted by Allied intelligence officers, the theme of overwhelming American production emerged repeatedly in their testimonies. General Heinz Guderian, the famed Panzer commander who had revolutionized armored warfare in the 1930 spoke candidly during his debriefing in August 1945. "We knew America was wealthy, but wealth alone does not translate to military might. What we failed to understand was how quickly civilian factories could be converted to war production, and how efficiently they could operate once converted." Guderian paused, looking down at his hands before continuing. "In Germany, we had the finest engineers and designers in the world. Our tanks, the Panther, the Tiger, were masterpieces of engineering. But what good is the perfect tank when the enemy can build 20 for each one of yours?" This was our fundamental miscalculation. The roots of this miscalculation ran deep in German military thinking. Since the 19th century, German strategy had emphasized quality of equipment and training over raw numbers. This approach had served them well in previous conflicts, but World War II introduced a new scale of industrial warfare that rendered old doctrines obsolete. What made America's achievement all the more remarkable was that tank production represented only a fraction of its overall war effort. Even as those 50,000 Sherman tanks rolled off assembly lines, American factories were simultaneously producing over 300,000 aircraft, 124,000 pieces of artillery, 4 million military trucks, 17 million rifles, and a staggering 41 billion rounds of ammunition. The human stories behind these numbers reveal the true nature of America's industrial mobilization. At the Willow Run bomber plant near Detroit, a facility that Charles Lindbergh had claimed would be impossible to operate effectively, workers achieved production rates that seemed to defy physical limitations. Rose Monroe was one of thousands of women who joined the industrial workforce during the war. Before 1941, she had been a homemaker in rural Michigan. By 1943, she was helping build B-24 Liberator bombers at Willow Run, becoming one of the real-life inspirations for Rosie the Riveter. "When I started, it took us almost a month to complete one bomber," she recalled in a post-war interview. "By 1944, we were finishing one every 63 minutes. The men who designed the plant said it couldn't be done, but we did it anyway." This story repeated itself across America. Shipyards that had once required years to build a vessel were now launching fully equipped Liberty ships in days. Electronics factories that had produced radios for living rooms were now manufacturing sophisticated radar systems. Textile mills shifted from fashionable clothing to parachutes and uniforms. The transformation extended beyond traditional manufacturing centers. In Grand Rapids, Michigan, furniture makers applied their woodworking skills to produce gliders for airborne operations. In Louisville, Kentucky, distilleries converted from bourbon production to manufacturing medical alcohol and synthetic rubber. Back on the European front, the psychological impact of America's production miracle became increasingly evident as the war progressed. Captured German soldiers, especially those taken during the final months of the conflict, often expressed disbelief when told about American manufacturing statistics. One Luftwaffe pilote, shot down over France in late 1944, refused to believe his American interrogator when told that the United States was producing fighter aircraft at a rate of over 000 per month. "Impossible," he declared. "Germany has the most advanced aircraft industry in the world, and we cannot build even 000 per month." When shown photographs of American aircraft factories stretching across acres of land with completed planes lined up by the hundreds, the German pilot fell silent. After several minutes, he finally spoke again, his voice barely audible. "If this is true, then Germany has been fighting a war it could never win." This realization, that Germany had fundamentally misjudged its opponent, became increasingly common among German officers as Allied forces pushed deeper into the Reich. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding German forces during the failed Ardennes offensive, Battle of the Bulge, was reportedly stunned by how quickly American units recovered from the initial surprise attack. "We destroy their tanks, and the next day they have new ones," he told his staff. "We exhaust their ammunition, and more arrives overnight. It is like fighting against the sea itself. No matter how many waves you turn back, more keep coming. The contrast with Germany's own production situation could not have been more stark. By 1944, Allied bombing had reduced many German factories to rubble. Those that remained operational were dispersed, often relocated to underground facilities or remote areas, making efficient production nearly impossible. Critical raw materials were in increasingly short supply. Petroleum shortage meant that many newly produced German tanks sat immobilized, unable to reach the front. Trained personnel became scarce as casualties mounted, forcing the Reich to rely on ever younger recruits and forced labor from occupied territories. Yet despite these mounting obstacles, Hitler continued to demand miracle weapons: the Verdun rocket, the Me 262 jet fighter, the massive Maus super-heavy tank that consumed precious resources while failing to address the fundamental production disparity. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, later wrote, "By 1944, I knew the war was lost. The production figures from America that crossed my desk each month were not just discouraging, they were crushing. Every time I presented these numbers to Hitler, he would dismiss them as Jewish propaganda. But I knew they were real, and I knew what they meant for Germany's future." The American production miracle had implications beyond the European theatre. In the Pacific, where American forces faced an equally determined enemy in Imperial Japan, the same industrial might proved decisive. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, had studied in the United States and understood American industrial capacity better than most Japanese leaders. "I fear all we have done," he reportedly said after Pearl Harbor, "is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Yamamoto's concerns proved prophetic. Even as America poured tanks and equipment into Europe, it simultaneously built a vast naval force in the Pacific. By 1944, the U. Navy had more aircraft carriers in operation than Japan had warships of all types combined. Japanese intelligence officers, like their German counterparts, initially dismissed reports of American production as exaggeration. By the time they recognized the truth, it was too late. The industrial gap was too wide to close. Back in the European theatre, the psychological breaking point for many German commanders came during the Allied crossing of the Rhine in March 1945. What German military planners had envisioned as a desperate last stand along Germany's historic natural barrier turned instead into a stunning demonstration of American material superiority. At the Remagen bridgehead, American engineers arrived with prefabricated bridge sections, massive amounts of construction equipment, and endless supplies. When German aircraft managed to damage one pontoon bridge, American forces simply built another alongside it within hours. German commanders, watching from the eastern bank, saw not just defeat but the collapse of their entire conception of modern warfare. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who had commanded German forces in the West for much of the war, later reflected, "The Americans' material superiority was so great that tactical skill was no longer needed. Their tanks were not as good as ours, nor were their infantry as well trained. But it didn't matter. They simply rolled over us with their masses of material." This assessment, while reflecting the bitterness of defeat, missed a crucial point. America's production miracle wasn't merely about quantity. It also represented a different philosophy of warfare, one that valued the lives of its soldiers by providing them with precious of sound, overwhelming material support. The Sherman tank embodied this philosophy perfectly. While German tanks like the Tiger and Panther were designed to win tank versus tank duels, the Sherman was designed to win wars. Its reliability meant fewer crewmen were stranded in enemy territory. Its standardized parts meant faster repairs. Its simpler design meant new crew members could be trained quickly. Most importantly, its availability in vast numbers meant that American commanders could afford to be aggressive, knowing that losses could be replaced. German commanders, by contrast, became increasingly conservative with their irreplaceable heavy tanks, often holding them in reserve rather than risking their loss. As the war in Europe neared its conclusion, a final poignant scene played out that captured the essence of America's production advantage. In April 1945, as American force drove deeper into Germany, they occasionally encountered bizarre contraptions on the roads, makeshift tanks cobbled together from civilian vehicles, farm equipment, and whatever armor plating could be salvaged from damaged military vehicles. These desperate creations, often manned by Hitler Youth teenagers, represented the final gasp of German resistance. Meanwhile, brand new Sherman tanks, fresh from factories in Detroit and just weeks removed from their Atlantic crossing, continued to arrive at the front by the hundreds. One American tank commander, encountering one of these improvised German vehicles, ordered his gunner to hold fire when he realized the crew consisted of boys no older than 15. After accepting their surrender, he gave them food from his tank's ample supplies. Another luxury German forces had long since forgotten. They stared at our chocolate bars and canned beef like they were looking at gold. The American officer later recalled, "One of them asked me through an interpreter how America could afford to feed its soldiers so well while fighting a war on two fronts." I didn't have the heart to tell him that Americans at home were eating even better than we were. In the final analysis, America's tank production miracle represented more than just an industrial achievement. It embodied a national philosophy, a belief that the lives of soldiers were precious and should be protected by material abundance rather than sacrificed to compensate for material scarcity. While German propaganda had long mocked American society as soft and decadent, the reality proved very different. The same nation that produced Hollywood movies and consumer appliances demonstrated that it could, when necessary, redirect its productive energies with a focus and determination that the regimented societies of the Axis powers could not match. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, Allied survey teams fanned out across the defeated Reich to assess its industrial capabilities and war-making potential. What they discovered shocked even those who had been confident of ultimate victory. German tank production had never exceeded an 100 units in a single month. American factories had routinely produced over 300 per month. German aircraft production reached its peak at approximately 000 planes monthly. American factories had maintained production rates of over 9,000 aircraft per month for the last 2 years of the war. Perhaps most tellingly, the survey teams discovered that German industry had never fully converted to a war footing. Consumer goods production had continued throughout much of the conflict, partly due to Nazi concerns about civilian morale, and partly due to the influence of industrialists who preferred profitable commercial contracts to strictly regulated military production. By contrast, American civilian production had been almost completely subordinated to the war effort. Automobile production for civilian use ceased entirely from 1942 to 1945. Consumer appliances vanished from store shelves. Even children's toys were repurposed, with metal components being replaced by wood and cardboard to conserve strategic materials. The lesson was not lost on post-war military planners around the world. The Soviet Union, in particular, restructured its entire economy to emphasize heavy industry and military production, seeking to match the industrial capacity that America had demonstrated during the war. This emphasis on production capacity continued to shape military thinking throughout the Cold War. When Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev famously declared, "We will bury you," to Western diplomats in 1956, he was referring not to military conquest, but to economic and industrial output, the lessons of World War II still fresh in Soviet strategic thinking. For the Wehrmacht generals who had witnessed America's production miracle firsthand, the psychological impact never fully faded. Many carried to their graves the knowledge that their defeat had been sealed not on the battlefield, but on the factory floor, years before the fighting ended. General Franz Halder, who had served as chief of the German General Staff during the critical early years of the war, summarized this realization in his post-war writings. "We began this war believing that superior tactics, superior training, and superior equipment would bring us victory. We never understood that modern war is fundamentally an industrial contest. By the time we realized this truth, America's factories had already determined the outcome." The numbers tell the final story with stark clarity. During World War II, Germany produced approximately 25 000 tanks. The Soviet Union, despite having much of its industrial base overrun in the early stages of the war, managed to produce Cent 000, and the United States, which had built fewer than 000 tanks total in the decade before Pearl Harbor, produced 428, 410 tanks and self-propelled guns between 1942 and 1945. Of these American-produced armored vehicles, nearly 50,000 were variations of the Wehrmacht Sherman tank. They served not only with American forces, but were supplied in large numbers to Great Britain, the Free French forces, China, and even the Soviet Union. In the decades following the war, military historians would debate whether the Sherman tank was technically superior to its German counterparts. Most concluded that, in a one-on-one comparison, German heavy tanks held significant advantages. But as the war itself demonstrated, such technical comparisons missed the larger point. A single Tiger tank, formidable as it was, represented little strategic value when faced with 20 Shermans. A perfect tank design meant nothing if it could not be produced in sufficient numbers, transported to the front, supplied with adequate fuel and ammunition, and maintained in battlefield conditions. The true genius of the American approach lay not in creating the perfect weapon, but in creating an adequate weapon in overwhelming quantities, and then backing it with the logistics, fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and trained personnel needed to make it effective. For the Wehrmacht generals who watched in disbelief as those seemingly endless columns of Sherman tanks rolled past them in the war's final months, the sight represented more than just military defeat. It represented the failure of an entire way of thinking about warfare. A philosophy that had prioritized tactical brilliance and technological sophistication over the unglamorous but decisive factors of production, capacity, and logistical support. In the end, the shock those German officers experienced was not just about the 50,000 tanks they never knew America had. It was about the realization that they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern industrialized warfare, a misunderstanding that had doomed their nation to defeat from the very beginning. As one unnamed German general reportedly remarked to his American captors in the spring of 1945, "It took us too long to understand that while war is fought with atomic weapons, it is won by factories. By the time we learned this lesson, your factories had already decided our fate." The legacy of America's wartime production miracle extended far beyond military victory. The organizational techniques, manufacturing innovations, and management practices developed during the war years laid the groundwork for the unprecedented economic boom that followed. Workers who had mastered new skills during wartime production carried those capabilities into the post-war economy. Women who had proven their abilities in factories and shipyards changed American perceptions of gender roles in the workplace. And the demonstrated power of government-industry cooperation shaped economic policy for decades to come. Perhaps most importantly, America's industrial achievement during World War II established a strategic reality that would define the remainder of the 20th century. No nation could hope to challenge the United States militarily without first matching its productive capacity, a feat that proved beyond the reach of even the Soviet Union during the 4-decade Cold War that followed. For those Wehrmacht generals who had once dismissed American industrial potential, the ultimate lesson was both simple and profound. In modern warfare, production capacity is not just one factor among many, it is the decisive factor that determines all others. As the war receded into history and a new global order emerged from its ashes, this lesson remained at the heart of American military strength, a strength based not primarily on technological sophistication or tactical doctrine, but on the enduring ability to outproduce any potential adversary. The 50,000 tanks that shocked those German officers in the winter of 1945 had long since been scrapped or relegated to museums, but the industrial might they represented remained a quiet but unmistakable reminder of America's capacity to transform itself from a peacetime economy to the arsenal of democracy whenever the need arose. Up next, You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.